I have one more book for you today to review, and it was a little bit less successful than the other book I just reviewed for you today, The Man in Nature and the Renaissance. This book is an author by is a book by someone whose author has a lot of credentials going for him, but the book was really disappointing in some ways, actually. I'm sad to say. The book is Identity and Violence by Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen was the 1998 Nobel laureate in economics. He, I think, holds dual professorships at both Harvard and Oxford, or Harvard and Cambridge. That's right, and is known pretty widely for his. I think he did a lot of work with developing the capabilities approach, as it is pertained to in economics, and a lot of other people work with it, like Martha Nussbaum works with it in philosophy. And he works a lot with rational choice theory. So that's what he won his Nobel Prize for, and he wrote this book, I think, around 2006. The book is interested, as you can probably tell from the title, in the question of human identity and its inherent multiplicity, and the choices that we make in regard to aligning ourselves with certain identities over others. We all have multiple identities, which Sen repeatedly points out. For example, he says of himself, quote, "I can be at the same time an Asian, an Indian citizen, a Bengali with Bangladeshi ancestry, an American or British resident, an economist, a dabbler in philosophy, an author, a Sanskritist, a strong believer in secularism and democracy, a man, a feminist, a heterosexual, a defender of gay and lesbian rights, with a non-religious lifestyle, from a Hindu background, a non-Brahmin, and a non-believer in an afterlife." So you have all of these identities. He's not just from Bangladesh, or he's not just an immigrant to America. He's not just a professor. He has these identities which occasionally bump up next to one another and clash. And really the question at the center of the book is, to what extent do these identities compete with one another? And in which ways are our senses of self and community wizened and sort of lessened and shrunken when, instead of recognizing the fullness of all these aspects of ourselves and of others, that we recognize just one or two of those aspects. For example, if we just call him a Muslim, or if we just call him an Indian, or we just look at less than the full picture. Seeing the world as just sets of different religions, or nationalities, or ideologies, or whatever else, communist versus non-communist, Muslim versus Christian, whatever, imposes what Sen calls a divisive power of classificatory priority on the world, which distorts and misshapes understanding of the people in the world. When we point out that a terrorist is Muslim, or overemphasize that aspect of their identity, we fall into a trap of identifying someone by just one aspect of their identity, often the most inflammatory or controversial one, suggesting that not all Muslims are violent, which sounds like a very helpful correct measure, commits the same fallacy of associating one aspect of someone's identity, namely their religion, with their behavior. So even to do the opposite and to sort of correct what seems blatantly wrong has an inherent fallacy of its own in it. And identifying people by one major trait, their religion, is one of the fundamental mistakes that Sen thinks Samuel Huntington does in his influential book, The Clash of Civilizations, in referring to various regions as the Christian world or the Muslim world or the Hindu world, his conclusions, Huntington's conclusions, are largely drawn from skewed perceptions of one aspect of a community's identity. Sen hardly touches on this explicitly, but it's obvious that this can have really important consequences for how, very practical consequences for how, say, the media covers news, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. We have a time, in a time where even the most important stories get only a few minutes devoted to them. Even on a national broadcast, it's easy to see how the complexities of both individuals and communities are elided in those few minutes. Historical misunderstanding can result just as frequently as when the tradition of democracy or religious toleration is identified solely with Europe or the Occident, as opposed to being fully historical about it and seeing where those phenomena are also found in the non-Western world. Sen discusses some of these just before the book starts to go into kind of an irrelevant tailspin at about its halfway point. And the second half of the book is unfortunately very unfocused and doesn't have much to do with the first half at all. It talks about things like multiculturalism, and it just gets off topic. The ideas that he has to say, that he mentions about identity, are important. However, there isn't a lot here that most intelligent people who've considered these ideas wouldn't have concluded for themselves. It's already more than a little obvious how detrimental this is for people who consume a lot of news and do so uncritically, which is probably what spurred many thoughtful people to think about this issue in the first place. Also, this book is about twice as long as it needs to be, namely because of the irrelevant second half. The last sections of the book, I mentioned multiculturalism, but he also brings in globalism. They're tangentially related to the book's central thesis, but they really need another book of their own to be fully fleshed out. And they aren't. And he doesn't give them enough space. Sen also said early on in the book that he would emphasize the role of a rational choice theory and rational choice making in our ability to choose one identity over the other, or why we impose one identity over another when we are looking at members of another community. And he didn't really do that as much as I would have liked him to do. Instead, you get a lot of aimless wandering from topic to topic that the second half of the book provides and is full of. This would have been a good, if pretty uncontroversial, article aimed at a more scholarly audience, say, in an academic journal or something. But there was no practical use in doubling its length to make a book. Unfortunately, this seems to be a common trait in this book is actually part of a series called it's Norton's Issues of Our Time series, and another book in that series is Kwame Anthony Appiah's Cosmopolitanism, which I've also read, have not reviewed, I don't think, but it suffers from a lot of the same shortcomings. But if those topics seem interesting to you and you think about them, and it's hard not to these days, read the first 3 or 4 chapters and then you can safely put it down. Identity and Violence by Amartya Sen.